The Sea. A short story by Daniel Miller. On the surface of the water, the perfect summer is in full swing. The ladies take to the sun, families split between the activities of building sand castles, creaming their arms and faces with sunblock, and inflating the floats and beach balls. Youthful couples setting up their spots on the sand and enjoying the company of each other's arms. The lifeguard perched in his small tower, while his buddies take shifts between inspecting the shoreline and bantering, and the dogs enjoying themselves playing with their owners. Katrina and Ken were obscured by the windbreaks they planted into the sand, now that the only line of sight they had was the sea, which beckoned the beachgoers. There was no one who could see them, or watch them, feeling each other's bodies against one another, as they exchanged kisses, coiling one another in their limbs. The lovebirds have been dating for almost a year now, since they first laid eyes on each other during the second semester after the Christmas holidays had finished. The two experienced an immediate attraction. Ken was smart, handsome, and physically well-formed. Having lived in this small resort for most of his life, he enjoyed the hot seasons. He would inhale the refreshing, salt-sprinkled air and take that cooling dip in the sea. He was never tired of living here, and there was always a sense of therapy in this place when he was going through hard times. Katrina, affectionately referred to as Kat by Ken and some of her close friends, moved out to this idyllic place to combine study and play after experiencing the freedom of swimming in the open sea. Her gorgeous face, beautifully admirable figure, her hazel eyes and wonderful smile had some of the boys' attention as she entered the classroom. Quickly than she thought she would have, Katrina made friends with her colleagues and became involved in the scenery of kicking back after work. Like many couplings, it started with friendly hangouts between classes. Before either of them knew it, they thought of asking each other out on a date after class one day. Unlike most couplings, their first date had continued long into the night at Ken's apartment, not too far from the town streets, which opened up toward this exact beach. What had started out as offering a place to crash for the night had elevated into a blood-running, hot-bodied night of sex. The lights were off inside the apartment. Under the crumpled and disturbed bedsheet, the lovers in arms kissed and roved in each other's tender grasp all night long. Exhausted and short of breath afterwards, Ken and Kat continued to show love for one another with passionate kisses and hands interlocked. Here, on these sands, lying on their sides with each other's arms, the lovers gazed lazily into their eyes. The tender hands of a woman leafed over the chiseled Paxton forearm upwards, while the gentle hands studied passionately the silk-soft skin from behind the shoulders to the base of the lower back. The two smiled at each other as they stood up and journeyed towards the shoreline, hand in hand, with the arms semi-twined together. The water washing past their ankles backwards and forth was a nice, cooling sensation as the sun carried on the heat wave. 5 seconds in, they were waist deep in the sea. A further 5, and they were already swimming, diving under and then resurfacing, one at a time, their hot heads beginning to cool. The ocean can be bliss. Harriet James, a record shop owner, had been swimming these waters every summer for nearly 30 years. After the gymnasium was torn down to be updated for modern standards, she turned to the sea to keep herself maintained. Every time she went out into the water, she was in fine form. Not a great distance away, the lovers enjoyed the cool of the sea, treading with their feet as their arms waved in and out to keep them afloat. Drifting closer to one another, Kat and Ken snaked their arms around their bodies again, continuing the language of romance away from the confines of dry land. In the almost noiseless void of the waves, close to the beachhead, lay a beautiful small coral stretching out for 15 miles across the floor, inviting a variety of fish from far and wide to admire such colour, such formation, and such haven. Hand-sized visitors with the palette of the rainbow danced between small loops and tunnels among the rock. Little schools of silvery bluish fish paraded together over the aquatic plants. On the surface, the lovers began to dive down below. It was not a great distance to the floor as they were stroking above the coral's small tree line. Kat was almost beside herself admiring the scenery as she subconsciously reached out for Ken's hand. Feeling her light grasp, he turned to see her. Ken maneuvered around to hold Katrina like they did that night long ago. The lovers closed their eyes as their lips found each other, embracing amongst the nature of the water. From much, much further out to sea, a great fish navigated. To it these waters were new, unfamiliar, unexplainably cooler, nearly too cool for it to stay around. While its eyesight was impeccable, sharp, the hearing and scent receptors were sublime. They detected motion from afar, receiving audible traces without having to look directly at the source. In little time, the large creature had found the coral, hugging as closely to the floor as it was allowed to, avoiding any detection from above. The smaller fish darted away, too fast for the bigger visitor to give chase. The eyes were pitch black, as if they were without life, devoid of soul, without compassion. The reverbing sounds of splashing and indecipherable echoes from right on and beyond the surface had triggered the sensory pits on the snout. Without clear direction, the eyes drifted to see shadows which looked familiar, yet they were unfamiliar too. As one shadow appeared to be gliding quite peculiarly, one fin out in front of the other, and the other was back in, if they were fins. The second shadow divided into two. In silent solitude below, the great fish watched as it repeated rotating in circular motion, jaws subliminally opening and closing for air to pass through its slit-like gills, or else it would sink to the bottom and die from drowning. "Race you back to the beach?" Ken challenged Kat. She grinned mischievously as she announced the prize for first place. "First one to shore gets out the beer," she said, with a little hint that Ken was quick to catch on to. "You're on." The lovers raced for the sand as fast as their respective front crawls could take them. It heard the sounds of splashing. It saw the shadows making a getaway to the shoreline. The unrelenting hunger it endured the whole voyage from its previous home had left it desperate. With one failed attempt on seagulls after another, it had to feed, even if the taste buds resented the catch. The last circulation had finished, and the fish propelled itself upwards toward the shapes. The crest-finned tail thrusted its tapered, streamlined body like a torpedo fired from a submarine in combat. The mouth became more agape after each rushing brush of the tail. The long fins behind the side of the head constantly adjusted to maintain a straight line. The eyes started to flare little corners of white, the flesh lined with teeth crawling out from under the skull. Now it was within striking distance. Kat and Ken were neck and neck as they were just 5 seconds away from walking in shallow water. Just as they were taught by their own teachers in their own pools years ago, miles apart. Turn to the side, breathe with one arm up, back down with the other. 3 seconds left. It didn't matter anymore. They just swim until they run aground. 2 seconds. Kat looked left to Ken. Ken looked right to Kat. They both looked down. And there it was. The gape was massive, just under half the size of their own bodies, in fact. The water erupted as the hunter, dark blackish grey on its back and plain white on its underbelly, impacted Ken directly, with the shock wave knocking Katrina off course. With no vocal cords generating a roar or a growl, not even a hiss, the vice clamped tightly around Ken. Underwater, through the distortion of bubbles, the shape of the fish was clearly visible. With the corruption of sound beneath the surface, the screams and punctures could still be heard. Ken screamed out bubbles as the water was dyed red and black eyes mooned over into white. From the snout shrouded in blood to the tip of the tail, the length must have been 7 or 8 feet, perhaps stretching over that. Suddenly, the giant shape turned away from Ken and now looked into Katrina's eyes. It was as if she gazed into the devil himself. Nudging her leg with the side of its head, scratching her with a tooth or two, the attacker left for deeper waters. Surfacing in red, Katrina screamed in agony. She was fighting to stay afloat while holding on to her cut-open leg. Suddenly she froze with fear, like she did moments ago, at the sight of a black dorsal fin breaking the surface and gliding away out to sea, where it dived again. Too stunned to scream or even cry, Katrina gazed out into the open ocean in shock. She didn't even react when Harriet and a few other beachgoers rushed over to the rescue. On the sands, the blood was leaving Ken faster than it was Katrina. All around onlookers glared mortified, children crying at the carnage as their parents did their best to protect them from looking any more. It wasn't until the doors of the ambulance slammed shut and that Katrina began to cry and scream, thrashing about as the paramedics fought to hold her down and sedate her. Nobody would ever have guessed it would happen, but today the unthinkable had happened. A nightmare, a scenario of fiction, became a reality. It was a shark.